I just want to remind everyone that the only people who will have their cameras on the entire time are the two advocates and myself, witnesses as needed. Everyone else should have their cameras off and their mics muted. I will read a script which lets you know when to go from gallery view to speaker view. If there's any issue with technology during the trial, somebody speak up because I may not notice it, or it could be me for that matter. So we'll just try to do the best that we can with the technology. Hopefully the marshals will get that dog under control. And that's it. So I'm going to now call the case of United States versus Kara Bassett. And I'm going to ask the attorneys to make appearances, please.
Good morning, Your Honor. Members of the jury, my name is Marquise Nickerson on behalf of the U.S. government, alongside my co-counsel, Your Honor.
Good morning, Your Honor, members of the jury. My name is Grace Stroud, and I am the second chair for the prosecution.
Good morning.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Charlie Abowd. I'm joined today by my co-counsel, Jasjeev Singh, who I believe is temporarily kicked out of this meeting, but he should be joining shortly. Mr. Singh will be assisting me with the technological aspects of today's trial, and together we represent the defendant, Kara Bassett.
Good morning, Mr. Abowd. Do we need to wait for your second chair to arrive?
Yes, Your Honor, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay, can we handle preliminary matters to the extent that there are any before that? Or do you need your second chair here for those?
We can handle those, Your Honor.
I am ready.
Okay, then I'll hear from the government first. Mr. Nickerson, do you have any preliminary matters to attend to?
Yes, Your Honor. Maybe some that all witnesses have been pre-sworn.
Yes.
Maybe some that all exhibits have been pre-marked.
Any problem with that, Mr. Abowd?
No, Your Honor.
So marked.
We'd also like to turn the court's attention to stipulation 7, which says that exhibits 4 through 33 are pre-admitted, Your Honor.
Is that your understanding, Mr. Abowd?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
4 through 33 are in.
And Your Honor, just to check, is screen sharing already allowed for second chairs and attorneys, Your Honor?
I think that the organizer said that was true. I certainly don't have the ability to do that, I don't think. So maybe we ought to check that out and see whether they can share their screens before we get started.
We are able to, Your Honor, yes.
Okay, good. Is that true for you too, Mr. Abowd?
I believe so, yes, Your Honor.
You don't know because your second chair hasn't arrived.
He just arrived just now. So with that, we're ready to proceed.
Okay, good.
And the prosecution ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Abowd, did you have any preliminary matters?
No, I believe Mr. Nickerson covered all of the pretrial matters that we had in mind. So with that, we're ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Excellent. Well, we should now switch to speaker view, and I will hear the government's opening statement.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
And can you hear me well from this distance, Your Honor?
Yes, I can.
All right. She didn't ask the questions because she already knew the answer. She never asked what happened to Don Clark. She never asked where is Don Clark. She never asked who killed Don Clark, because she already knew the answer. Today, the U.S. government has brought forth murder charges against the defendant, Kara Bassett. After Don Clark disappeared on August 18th of 2017 and was declared deceased a year later. Now, as the prosecution, we've been bound by a burden of proof. We have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Kara Bassett, killed her husband, and that she killed her husband with malice aforethought. Now, to simplify all that legal jargon, it simply means we have to prove to you that she killed Don Clark deliberately and intentionally, or with a callous and wanton disregard for human life. And in order to prove this to you today, we are going to walk you through a story that will outline a motive, a disappearance, and a reaction. A story that will show you that at the end, the defendant, Kara Bassett, received everything that she ever wanted. So the story is going to begin here with the motive. Today, you're going to hear about a woman who loves elephants. She's passionate about elephants. And the one thing she always wanted was an elephant sanctuary. But you will hear that she had a husband that didn't have the same image. Don Clark saw it as a profit, saw it as a zoo. And you'll hear that this upset Kara Bassett. It upset her so much that she threw a vase at his head. That she said, "We will see how this ends." That she said, "I will send anyone to their graves." That she said, "I will do anything to protect these elephants." And after hearing about her frustration for the fact that she didn't get her sanctuary, the next thing you will hear about is Don Clark's disappearance on August 18th of 2017. Now, as a prosecution, we plan to show you, no, we will show you that the cause of this disappearance was the fact that Kara Bassett murdered him. You will hear about a tranquilizer that was used to murder Don Clark. You will hear that after hitting him with this tranquilizer, we suspect that she moved his body to Big Gump Swamp, in which we will show algae evidence connecting her boots and the van she used that night to transport him to that swamp. And after hearing about the evidence that proves the murder, you will then hear about her reaction. You will hear that it took her 1 week to call authority. And that during that 1 week, never did she ask, "Where is Don Clark? What happened to my husband? Who killed my husband?" Never did she say any of those things because she already knew the answers. And you will see that at the end of this trial. And when you go back there to deliberate at the end, you will have no choice but to find in favor for the prosecution and find justice for Mr. Clark and hold Ms. Bassett guilty for the murder of Don Clark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nickerson. Mr. Abowd.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, and members of the jury, may it please the court. They don't have a body. They don't have a murder weapon. They don't have an eyewitness. All they have is a story. It's August 18th, 2017. Just another usual day of work at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. Kara Bassett finishes her work, tells her husband goodnight, and goes to bed, not knowing that she would never see him again. She wakes up the next morning and sees a text from her husband saying, "I'm going out for a while." At first, she isn't worried. She thinks her husband is just going on a trip to Costa Rica. But as the days go by, she starts to realize that something was wrong. So she calls the authorities, hoping that they can give her some answers. But instead of giving her those answers, they put her in handcuffs and charge her with the murder of her husband. Now, in today's case, the government has charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with murder. And for that reason, they carry the burden of proof. It's their responsibility to prove that Mrs. Bassett murdered her husband intentionally and deliberately beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, that's the highest standard in our legal system. But they won't be able to meet that burden because they don't have a body. They don't have a murder weapon. They don't have an eyewitness. All they have is a story. Now, members of the jury, in a moment, you'll hear from Steph Branham, the government's witness and the lead investigator into Don Clark's disappearance. She's going to explain to you how in a missing persons investigation, the first thing they look for is a body. She's going to tell you how they looked at the property, they looked at the Big Gum Swamp, but they found no signs of a struggle, and they found no body. Now, another thing Mr. Nickerson talked about in his opening statement is a syringe of carfentanil. Now, this is the government's alleged murder weapon, but members of the jury, they never found that murder weapon. And throughout the course of today's trial, they'll never be able to present you with any physical evidence showing that that carfentanil was the cause of death. They don't have a body and they don't have a murder weapon. They're going to try to tell you, as Mr. Nickerson stated today, walk you through a story. But members of the jury, the story that they tried to tell you, that Mrs. Bassett murdered her husband and dumped his body in a swamp, they don't have a single eyewitness to prove if that's true. But that's not the only problem with their story. You see, the government's story overlooks several key pieces of evidence that you're going to get to hear about today. The defense is calling Joe Young to the stand, an individual who was with Don Clark hours before his disappearance. She's going to tell you how at 6 p.m., Don Clark got a text message from Costa Rica that made his face go white with fear. She's going to tell you how Don Clark had ongoing issues with his ex-wife, Lisa Clark, who was suing him for alimony, who threatened to wipe him off the face of the earth. And as the evidence will show, she had no alibi for the night of his disappearance. Members of the jury, the government is going to try to tell you a story, but that story isn't good enough, because a story does not prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's for that reason that at the end of today's case, I'll ask you to find the defendant, Kara Bassett, not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abowd. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone now to switch to gallery view. And now the government may call its first witness.
The government calls Special Agent Steph Branham to the stand.
Special Agent Branham, consider yourself sworn.
And may I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
State your name for the record.
Good morning. My name is Special Agent Steph Branham.
And what do you do for a living, Special Agent Branham?
I'm an investigator with the FBI's Violent Crime Section within the Criminal Investigation Division.
Now, how long have you been a special investigator for the FBI?
Well, I started as a new trainee in 2002, and by 2003, I was promoted to a special agent. Since 2007, I've been working in the Violent Crime Section, and I've investigated over 100 violent crimes in that section.
And before being a special agent, what education did you receive?
I received education in evidence collection, criminal interrogation, and investigation.
Now, as an FBI agent, are you required to receive training for your position?
Yes, we complete training on an annual basis, and we also have all of our training before we are qualified as an agent.
And you use these trainings, these skills in your everyday line of work?
Yes, absolutely.
Now I have to sidetrack a bit here. Why are you here today, Special Agent Brennan?
I was the lead investigator who looked into the disappearance of Don Clark.
And as lead investigator on this case, did you use reliable methods to conduct your investigation?
Of course.
And are these methods widely accepted as a part of your field?
Yes, they are.
And did you rely on sufficient facts and data as a product of these reliable principles and methods?
Absolutely.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution offers Special Agent Branham as an expert in crime scene investigation with a specificity on evidence collection.
Mr. Abowd.
Your Honor, before I respond, may I inquire as to the type of opinion that Mr. Nickerson wishes to elicit?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Your Honor, before I respond, I would simply like to know what exactly Mr. Nickerson, what type of opinion he wants to elicit from this witness as an expert witness under 702.
What's your response to that, Mr. Nickerson?
Your Honor, the opinion that we're soliciting here is that based on all the evidence that she collected in today's case, she was led to find Kara Bassett as the main murderer for her husband, Don Clark.
Let's do this. If you hear something that, first of all, do you accept the agent as an expert in crime scene investigation evidence collection, Mr. Abowd?
Yes, Your Honor. For that limited purpose, I have no objection. But I do have an objection to any opinions regarding Mrs. Bassett's guilt or innocence. I don't believe specialization in evidence collection provides a witness, an expert witness, with the ability to comment on a witness's guilt or innocence when they don't have direct access, when they weren't present at the scene of the crime. And for that reason, I would object to any opinions given on that issue.
Well, rather than we hypothesize that's what's going to happen, why don't you wait and see if it does, and then you can object if you think it's necessary, and we'll deal with it at that moment. Okay?
Yes,
So the agent is recognized as proffered.
Yes, Your Honor. So let's talk about your investigation into today's case. Did you ever look into the motive behind Kara Bassett?
Yes, we did. We found that Kara Bassett always wanted to turn the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park from a zoo to a sanctuary. Her and Don Clark disagreed on that fact, and that led her to request a power of attorney form so that she could get control of his assets if he were ever to disappear.
Now, what is this power of attorney form you're referring to?
This is a form that Kara Bassett had made up 3 months before Don disappeared. The disappearance clause states that if Don Clark were ever to go missing, she would inherit all of his assets.
Now, I'd like to focus on how this disappearance clause came about. Your Honor, may I have my co-counsel display Exhibit 4 to the jury?
Sure, and you need not ask leave. You can just ask for your co-counsel to do that, okay?
Yes, Your Honor. And Exhibit 4. Now, do you recognize this document, Special Agent Branham?
I do.
And what is this document?
This is a letter from the lawyer of Don Clark, Mandy Tuminelli.
And when this letter, did it ever explain to you how this disappearance clause came about?
Yes, the defendant specifically requested one.
And do you know why the defendant requested one?
Well, from the findings of our investigation, we determined that it was because the defendant needed a way to get control of
Objection,
Don.
speculation.
As to what?
As to the reasons for Mrs. Bassett wanting to include a certain clause in this document, sir.
Mr. Nickerson.
Your Honor, she's basing her knowledge on this document here, Exhibit 4, in which it lays out why she included this disappearance clause, Your Honor.
Mr. Abowd?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness may testify to what's contained in this document, which is admitted into evidence, but for her to testify as to what she believes Mrs. Bassett's reasoning or thought process would be delving into the mindset of Mrs. Bassett and would therefore be speculation.
As I understood Mr. Nickerson, he says that it's in there, what this agent is testifying to. It's in the exhibit. Is that what my understanding, Mr. Nickerson? Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Can you point us to where that is?
It'd be the second page, Your Honor, the very first paragraph. Where it talks about solely at Ms. Clark's direction, she asked her why, Your Honor.
Mr. Abowd?
Again, Your Honor, the witness may testify to those statements and what's included in that document, but I don't believe that document says anything specifically about Mrs. Bassett's mindset and what reason she wanted to, at least what the witness testified to.
Okay, then I will overrule the objection, but if you think it goes beyond what's in the exhibit, then you can object again.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, according to this exhibit, why did Ms. Clark include this power of an attorney disappearance clause?
This letter notes that she asked for this disappearance clause to be included because Don Clark was involved with some sketchy business in Costa Rica.
And did you investigate this business?
Yes, we did.
Now, if Don Clark were to disappear, how much would Miss Bassett be inheriting?
$8 million.
I'd like to move on here. Aside from her motive, did you investigate the reason behind the disappearance of Don Clark?
Yes, we did. From the findings of our investigation, we concluded that Kara Bassett, the defendant, murdered Don Clark.
Well, let's talk about those findings. What weapon did you choose as the murder weapon for this investigation?
We found that it was a syringe of carfentanil that went missing from a locked shed on the park's property that the defendant had access to.
Well, how did you know that it was this carfentanil specifically?
When we investigated, we found that there were only 23 syringes in that shed, according to a log that the park maintained. However, there were supposed to be 24. One syringe was missing and unaccounted for.
Well, I'd like to direct your attention to that log. Your Honor, may I have my co-counsel display Exhibit 19 for the jury?
Yes, remember, Mr. Nickerson, you don't need to ask permission to do so. Just direct your co-counsel to do what you need done.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, could you point out where on that log it states the amount of tranquilizers that you were looking for?
Yes, it says August 1st, 2017, there were supposed to be 24 syringes.
And how many were at the park at the time when you investigated?
We only found 23.
And according to this logbook, who signed off on these tranquilizers?
Various employees, but the last person was Kara Bassett. On this document, she is noted as Kara Clark.
Now, after saying tranquilizer was the cause of the murder, how do you explain Don Clark's body being missing?
From GPS records, we were able to determine that Don Clark's van was driven from the park's property at 11:17 p.m. on the night of his disappearance to the Big Gum Swamp, where it arrived at 1:26 a.m. It was stationary there until 2:10 a.m., and it arrived at the Cary Bell-Leon Airport at 4:29 a.m. This indicated that the defendant had driven his van to that swamp to dispose of the body and the murder weapon.
Now, how do you make the connection between the swamp and the defendant?
Well, in addition to the GPS records, we also found algae samples from the swamp that matched the defendant's possessions, specifically Don Clark's van, a wheelchair on the park's property that we believe she used to transport that body into the van, and her boots.
Well, how did you test this algae to figure this out?
Well, we were able to determine this because the cladophora and spirogyra strains of algae are extremely rare to be seen together. However,
Objection, improper opinion as to the rarity of these algae types.
Mr. Nickerson.
Response, Your Honor. Pursuant to Rule 702 and 703, she relied on a forensics analysis report as a portion of her investigation. Therefore, she has personal knowledge, Your Honor, pursuant to Rule 602, as to how this algae came about, Your Honor.
May I
Mr.
respond,
Abowd.
Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, I wasn't objecting to whether or not she has personal knowledge of this matter. I was objecting to her expertise as it relates to algae and the forensic report involved with the algae collection. This witness is qualified as an expert in evidence and crime scene investigation, but she's not qualified as an expert in algae.
Response,
What about
Your
that,
Honor.
Mr. Nickerson?
Your Honor, she's basing this on the algae report, Your Honor. This isn't her coming to a specialized conclusion. She's just relying on what the report told her on how the algae was tested, Your Honor.
Okay, have we seen that report?
I can show it to the jury, Your Honor, if you wish.
Okay, why don't we do that? I'll sustain the objection now. And if you can lay foundation for the testimony, then we'll revisit the question.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Shrug, may you display the forensics report on the algae? Can you scroll down to page 3? So, Ms. Branham, according to this report, how did the algae whereabouts come about?
well, this report indicates that the cladophora and spirogyra strains of algae are extremely rare when seen together.
Objection, improper opinion. May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Nowhere in this document does it say the words extremely rare. That's not a reflection of what was concluded in this forensic report. It's simply this witness's interpretation of that information, and therefore, for the reasons I stated previously, is an improper opinion.
Mr. Nickerson.
Your Honor, pursuant to Rule 703, if this is a basis of her investigation, the evidence collection portion, she can testify to things that would generally be seen as inadmissible to the jury, therefore not soliciting an improper opinion if it was based on evidence in her investigation, Your Honor.
Okay, so I understood your point initially to be that this document contained what the agent was testifying to. And as I look at the first paragraph, Mr. Abowd, what's different between where it says rare to see these two types of algae together and what the agent is saying?
Yes, Your Honor, the agent's characterization that it is extremely rare is not included in this report, and therefore would be her interpretation of it.
So it's the extremely aspect of the testimony that you're objecting to.
Yes, Your Honor, as well as any other testimony that is not directly reflected in this exhibit, I would object to.
Okay, well, I didn't hear you object to anything else specifically, so we'll sustain it as to extremely and strike that word. You may proceed.
So according to this report, once again, I'll ask, how did you come about in terms of the algae?
It's rare to see the cladophora and Spirogyra strains of algae together. However, they were found in both the samples from the Big Gum Swamp as well as the samples from the Elephant Park. This report also states that the exact same chemical compositions of the algae samples at the swamp match the samples at the Elephant Park. Now that's like seeing two identical snowflakes. It doesn't happen unless they're the same kind.
Now I'd like to move on here and talk about the defendant's reaction. Did you ever look into telephone communication of the defendant, Kara Bassett?
Of course.
Your Honor, may you display that for me, Ms. Strudd? Now let's focus on this first page here, the calls. Anywhere do you see a call from Kara Bassett to Don Clark after he disappeared?
No.
I'd like to focus on page 2, which the text messages. Anywhere in these text messages, do you see a text from Kara Bassett to Don Clark asking, "Where are you?"
No, that does not appear here.
Do you see a text message asking, "What happened to you, Don?"
No, sir.
Does anywhere in these messages does this show that Kara Bassett texted Don Clark after he disappeared on August 18th of 2017?
No, these texts do not show that.
And after your investigation into the motive, the disappearance, and the reaction, what were you led to do, Officer Brennan?
On September 12th, 2018, we gathered enough evidence to arrest the defendant, Kara Bassett.
Thank you, Your Honor. I pass this witness.
Cross-examination, Mr. Abowd?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent, I'd like to talk to you about your investigation. You were the lead investigator into Don Clark's disappearance. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And one of the things you looked for in your investigation was Don Clark's body. Isn't that right?
Yes, we did. That's a standard element of any investigation.
You searched the entire property at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, didn't you?
Yes, we did. However, we concluded that the body was not there as it was dumped in the Big Gum Swamp.
Well, ma'am, I'll get to that in a moment, but you actually found no signs of struggle at the Tallahassee Elephant Park, did you?
That's correct. Because this crime was committed by the defendant injecting Don Clark, there wouldn't have been any signs of violence or blood or anything like that.
Well, ma'am, I want to direct your attention. You actually searched for his body at the Big Gum Swamp. Isn't that correct?
Yes, we did.
That's where you claim Mr. Don Clark was dumped. Isn't that correct, ma'am?
That's correct.
Agent, you led an entire team of FBI investigators to that swamp. Isn't that correct?
Yes, we did.
And those investigators were equipped with trained dogs. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
The dogs had been giving Don Clark scent.
Yes, they had.
And you weren't able to find, in your own words, anything of significance. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. What you have to understand is the Big Gum Swamp is 13,000 acres. Now that's roughly 15 times the size of Central Park.
Objection. Move to strike. The latter portion of the witness's statement is unresponsive. I wasn't asking as to how large the Big Gum Swamp is in my question.
Response, Your Honor.
Please.
Your Honor, this witness is simply explaining her reasoning on behalf of what opposing counsel is questioning her on, which this witness is allowed to do on cross-examination, Your Honor.
What was the question you asked Mr. Abowd?
Your Honor, I was asking if she found anything of significance at the swamp. She went on to tell me about how large the swamp was. I was not asking that in my original question.
Sustained, and your request to strike is granted.
Yes, Your Honor. No, you weren't able to find anything of significance at the swamp, were you?
That's correct.
You weren't able to find bones, were you?
That's right.
No clothes?
That's correct.
And throughout the entire course of your investigation, you never found Don Clark's body, did you?
That's correct. We believe that it was submerged in the swamp and we couldn't find it because of the size.
Well, ma'am, I want to talk about some of the other things you believe happened in your investigation. Now, you talked on direct about a syringe of elephant tranquilizer. You believe that to be the murder weapon, isn't that correct?
Yes, all evidence points to that.
Well, let's talk about that evidence. You actually don't have, because Don Clark is dead, you don't have an autopsy report that you collected from his body, do you?
That's correct. If we don't have a body, we can't do an autopsy.
So you don't have any blood tests to show that carfentanil was the cause of death, do you?
That's correct. We weren't able to conduct those tests without the body.
And you were never able to find the missing syringe of carfentanil, which you talked about. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Because we believe it was submerged in the swamp, it would have been very difficult to find.
Ma'am, that's a yes to my question. You never found it?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're aware that multiple employees have access to those syringes. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to ask you about another piece of evidence that you talked. Well, I want to talk to you about what you believe happened on that night. Now, you claim that Kara Bassett murdered her husband and took him to a swamp, but the fact of the matter is you don't have a single eyewitness who can attest to that happening, do you?
Objection, Your Honor. Compound question.
What was compound about it, Mr. Nickerson?
The first portion of that question, Your Honor, was you believe that she murdered her husband that night, but you don't have any eyewitnesses to testify to that. Those are two separate questions alone, Your Honor. Therefore, it's compound.
May I respond?
Mr. Abowd? Yeah, please.
I was not asking a compound question. I was there were no two individual parts of the question that I was asking this witness, so it was not a compound question.
I think that was just a predicate for it. I don't think the first part required an answer, Mr. Nickerson. Overruled.
Now, you don't have a single eyewitness who saw Mrs. Bassett, who claims to see Mrs. Bassett murdering her husband, do you?
That's correct. Because the crime was committed in the middle of the night, it was very unlikely that we would find any eyewitnesses.
Ma'am, you don't have a single eyewitness who claims to see her driving the van 139 miles to a swamp, do you?
Yes, that's correct.
You don't have a single eyewitness who claims to see her at the Big Gum Swamp on the night in question, do you?
That's correct. Like I said, she arrived at the swamp at 1:26 a.m., so there would be no visitors at that time.
But while you believe that, you have no eyewitnesses to prove if that's true. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. We don't have any eyewitnesses at the swamp.
Now, what you do have is algae you collected from Mrs. Bassett's boots, but I'd actually like to take a closer look at that forensic report. Mr. Singh, could you put Exhibit 5? Now, Agent, this is the report that you concluded, from which you drew the conclusion that the algae from Mrs. Bassett's boots matched the algae at the Big Gum Swamp. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Now, if I could direct your attention to the conclusion section of this document, samples 1 through 3 refers to the algae from Mrs. Bassett's boots. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And if I could read the sentence, it states that samples 1 through 3 likely originated from Big Gum Swamp. This is not certain. Did I read that correctly?
That's correct, not certain. But given the Redfield ratio, which is the ratio of the chemicals in the samples from Big Gum Swamp to the chemicals in the samples on Kara Bassett's possessions, it is almost certain.
Ma'am, so it's not certain. Isn't that correct?
Not 100% sure, but as I said on direct, that's the same likelihood as two snowflakes being exactly alike.
Well, ma'am, you're not an expert in algae, are you?
No, I'm not specifically an expert in algae, but I am familiar with this forensics report.
You don't know what type of algae exists at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
That's correct. We didn't find any evidence of algae at that park.
Well, you never tested for algae at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, isn't that correct?
That's right. We
And the
tested a
reason-
golf cart at that property, and because the golf cart was driven around that property and tested negative, we were able to determine that the algae was not present on that property.
Ma'am, the fact of the matter is you never tested anywhere other than the Big Gum Swamp, and that's why it states that this is not certain. Isn't that correct?
That's right. The Big Gum Swamp was the only place that we found Kara Bassett could have dumped his body.
Now, ma'am, I'd like to talk to you about areas of your investigation that you didn't mention on direct examination. Now, you looked for alternate witnesses, isn't that correct?
Yes, and we were able to rule out all of their suspects.
Well, I want to talk about one of those suspects in particular. You're aware Don Clark has an ex-wife, Lisa Clark.
I am.
You're aware that she was suing him at the time of his disappearance.
Yes, that's correct.
You tried to interview her, didn't you?
We did. We tried to approach her at her Orlando home and on the phone.
She refused to cooperate with you.
She did. She declined an interview.
She never gave you an alibi, did she?
That's correct. However, we were able to rule her out as a suspect after looking into her a bit further.
Well, ma'am, you never interviewed her, and when you asked her about her husband's disappearance, she said, "I hope that bleep is dead."
Objection,
Isn't
Your
that
Honor,
correct?
hearsay.
Mr. Abowd?
Your Honor, I'm not using this testimony for the truth, so it's not hearsay pursuant to Rule 801C. Rather, I'm using this testimony to demonstrate the effect it should have had on this witness's investigation.
Response, Your Honor.
Please.
Being that they are using this statement to show the effect that it had on the investigation and the fact that she did not look into Lisa Clark is being offered for the truth of the matter asserted that this statement should have been a reason to look into Lisa Clark, Your Honor.
Overruled.
May I respond?
The objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. So bringing you back to my question, when you asked Lisa Clark, she told you, "I hope that bleep is dead." Isn't that correct?
That is what she said.
Thank you, ma'am. No further questions.
Mr. Nickerson, am I correct? Are you out of time?
Yes, Your Honor, so no redirect.
Okay. The witness is excused. Thank you for your testimony, ma'am. You may step down. Anything further from the government?
No, Your Honor, the government rests at this time.
Mr. Abowd, you may call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Joe Young to the stand. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi.
Before I get started, are you able to hear and see me clearly?
Oh, yes. Same for me. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, ma'am, I can. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, my name is Joe Young. I'm a TV producer and documentarian.
Ma'am, could you speak up a bit? I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Oh, of course. Let me repeat my answer then. Is that okay? My name is Joe Young, and I am a TV producer and documentarian. Is that better?
Yes, ma'am, it is. And what type of documentaries do you produce?
Well, I've worked on a lot of things that you've probably heard of. One of the things is the Real Housewives of Atlanta. I really have an eye for the drama. But I've started to move into more nature films. I wanted to test my expand my palette.
And are you familiar with the defendant, Kara Bassett?
Yes.
And how do you know her, ma'am?
Oh, well, she hired me in 2015 to work on a documentary about her life at working with elephants.
What was that documentary about, ma'am?
Well, it was called Elephant Queen, and it was basically about the life of Kara and her husband and what it took to run an elephant park.
And how long were you working on this documentary?
Well, I started work in August of 2015, and I stopped in September of 2018 when Kara was arrested.
And what type of activities did you film as a part of this documentary?
Oh, I filmed everything. It was the sort of thing where you wanted to get the real stuff, but also that little extra drama. So I would film everyday life for Kara and her husband, but also the activities at the park, like taking care of the elephants.
Now, ma'am, you mentioned you filmed the everyday life of Kara and her husband. How would you describe their relationship?
had a pretty normal relationship. They got along, and they really knew how to turn up that drama for the camera. But they're a pretty normal couple.
Did they ever have any disagreements while you were at the park?
Oh, yes, they did. And it was great for the drama of the show. They would really turn it up for the camera.
Now, ma'am, I'd like to direct your attention to August 18th, the night of Don Clark's disappearance. Were you working at the park that day?
Yes, it was just a normal day.
And did you spend time with the defendant, Kara Bassett, during that day?
I did.
And what did you witness Mrs. Bassett doing throughout the course of the 18th?
Well, it was a pretty normal day. I actually didn't have a lot of footage because it was normal. She was acting normal, to my understanding.
Sorry, ma'am. Did you witness Mrs. Bassett having any fights with her husband that day?
Nope. Pretty boring, to be honest.
Now, when was the last time you saw her husband, Don Clark?
Oh, that was around 6 p.m.
And do you recall what Mr. Clark was doing when you last saw him at 6 o'clock?
I do, yes. I remember. I really wish I'd had a camera because I remember he got so scared at that time. The scariest I'd ever seen him. Would have been great for the documentary.
Objection, Your Honor, to improper character evidence, Your Honor, and speculation.
Okay, what's the improper character evidence?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say improper character evidence. I meant just speculation, Your Honor.
Okay, speculation. Mr. Abowd.
Yes, Your Honor. The witness is not speculating. She's describing, based on her rationally based perceptions, how Don Clark appeared to her when she was talking to him. She said he looked like he was scared, and therefore it's not speculation.
Response, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection. You can lay foundation for the testimony, Mr. Abowd, but right now it's sustained.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Young, do you remember what Mr. Clark was doing at 6 o'clock?
Yes, I do remember. I remember we were just talking normally, and then he took his phone out, and I remember he got this expression. He turned completely white. And I remember it was just like he just got really, like, it was flustered, and he walked out of the room.
And what caused him to have this reaction, ma'am?
Well, he looked at his phone.
And were you, now you were on the show 64 Minutes, weren't you?
Yes, I was. It was great exposure for my documentary.
And on that show, were you shown a record of Don Clark's phone records?
I was, yes.
Mr. Singh, if you could display that on the screen. Now, this is that record of Don Clark's phone that you saw on that TV show, isn't that correct?
Yes, it is.
Now, if I could direct your attention to the summary of text messages, do you see any texts that were sent at 6 p.m. that night?
Yes, line 7 and 8, yeah.
And what do those text messages say?
Well, they said, Llámame inmediatamente.
Who sent these text messages?
Well, it's from an unlisted phone number in Costa Rica.
And do you see if Don Clark had any phone calls after that point?
Yes, I remember on the interview, he got a phone call from he called the same number, yes.
And how long did that phone call last?
52 minutes.
Do you have any idea who Mr. Clark was talking to on this phone call?
No, I had no idea.
Do you have any idea who Mr. Clark was talking to?
No.
Now, ma'am, you mentioned that that's the last time you saw Don Clark. When was the next time you returned to the Elephant Park?
Well, on that night, I was leaving for a trip to Mexico. You know, I needed to refuel, rejuvenate, and I got back to the park on August 26th.
And when you returned to the park, what did you find upon your arrival?
Well, I found FBI agents all over the park. Like, it was really good material.
And seeing as to how you were working at this park for 2 years, did the FBI sit you down for a detailed interview?
No.
Did they ask you any questions?
No.
And ma'am, how many hours of footage did you get while you were working at the park?
I got over 2,000 hours of footage.
Did they ask you for any of that footage?
Nope, they didn't want to see any of it.
Now, did they ever ask you about Don Clark's wife, Lisa Clark?
Yes, they did talk about her. Lisa Clark, she was great material for the show. She would show up and they'd have some real fights, good, juicy stuff.
Well, during these fights, what would Lisa Clark say to her ex-husband?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for hearsay.
Mr. Abowd?
Your Honor, if I may proffer,
Sure.
these statements will be statements that are acting out in anger towards Don Clark, and therefore they're showing her state of mind and fall under an exception to hearsay pursuant to Rule 8033.
Response, Your Honor.
We don't know what the statements are, so why don't we wait and hear them? And then if you don't think that they fall within that exception, Mr. Nickerson, you can object again. Overruled at this time.
And what did Lisa Clark yell at her husband when she visited the park?
She said, "I will wipe you off the face of this earth."
Objection, Your Honor. I re-raise my objection as to hearsay.
Overruled.
And ma'am, how did those situations where she came and visited the park ever escalate?
Oh my gosh, they would get so heated. We had to call the police a couple times. It was really scary.
Thank you, Ms. Young. No further questions.
Mr. Nickerson, you may cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Cara Bassett loved elephants, isn't that right?
Yeah,
You knew her to be passionate about these elephants, correct?
yes, she was such a passionate person.
And you also knew that Cara Bassett wanted an elephant sanctuary, isn't that right?
Yep.
However, before Don Clark disappeared, she didn't have this elephant sanctuary, isn't that right?
Well, they had an elephant park.
But it wasn't a sanctuary, correct?
They aren't that different, but it wasn't called a sanctuary at that time.
Now, you knew that they had disagreements about how the park should be run, isn't that right?
Yeah.
You knew that Don Clark saw it as profit, correct?
Yes.
And you knew that Cara Bassett wanted it to be a cause, isn't that right?
Yeah, that was a big theme in the documentary, really jazzing that up for the screen. It was great drama.
However, in order for Cara Bassett to get that elephant sanctuary, she needed money, isn't that right?
Well, I'm
Section
not
lack
sure.
of personal knowledge.
Response, Your Honor.
Please.
Being that this witness has worked with them for over 3 years and has film on them for over 3 years, Your Honor, she would have personal knowledge as to the matters between Don Clark and Lisa Clark, as brought up in direct examination, Your Honor.
May I respond?
Abowd? Yes, please.
I believe the question asked, would Mrs. Bassett need money to convert the park into a sanctuary? Seeing as how this witness was just a documentary producer who just films Mrs. Bassett's everyday life, she wouldn't have personal knowledge as to what was required to potentially change the park in any way, and therefore it would be a lack of personal knowledge.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes.
I asked this witness that she knew that she needed money, Your Honor. I'm asking based on her personal knowledge of whether or not she knows. Therefore, she would be able to testify to this, Your Honor.
Well, I heard you say that something came out on direct that would support this testimony. What was that?
The fact that she was there to observe the relations between Don Clark and Cara Bassett, Your Honor. So she would know about their disagreements, and this is a portion of that disagreement.
Sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, you knew that Don Clark was wealthy, isn't that right?
Well, I just knew that he talked about money. Yeah.
And you knew that Lisa Clark got most of her income from Don Clark, isn't that right?
Well, that was my understanding. I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know and speculate about her income. She didn't talk about money a lot.
But you knew that Don gave her whatever she wanted, correct?
Yeah, well, he always gave her gifts. They had a good relationship like that.
Except at that time, she didn't have an elephant sanctuary, isn't that right?
Well, she had an elephant park, but it wasn't called a sanctuary at that time.
Right. Now, you also knew of them having arguments about this, isn't that right?
Oh, for the documentary, it was part of the drama aspect of it.
And you even recall in one of these arguments, she threw a vase at Don Clark's head, correct?
She really knew how to turn up the drama for the camera. It was great material.
Well, let me redirect you back to my question here. In this argument, she threw a vase at Mr. Clark's head, correct?
Well, yes, we were filming a reality TV show. I know how to get people to click.
Right, and you said she knew how to turn up for this TV show, isn't that right?
Yeah.
However, she made you delete this footage, isn't that right?
See, I wanted to make it like the Real Housewives, but the thing was, Kara cried when she was angry and got so puffy that she just didn't look good on camera. So
Well,
yeah, we
you
have
never
to delete.
back to my question here. She made you delete the footage, correct?
Yeah, she didn't look very good for camera.
I want to talk about the footage you do have. On June 15th of 2017, you recorded exhibits 35 through 38, isn't that right?
Yes.
The same exhibits that you displayed on 64 Minutes, correct?
Yes,
Same exhibits that are in court today, isn't that right?
that is correct.
And these exhibits are of a conversation with Kara Bassett and the camera, correct?
Yes, it was one of those interviews to kind of like bring that drama aspect to the show.
Right, and if I were to show you these exhibits, you would recognize them, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Your Honor, at this time, we enter exhibits 35 through 36, 38 into evidence, Your Honor.
Say those numbers again, please.
35 through 38, the videos of Kara Bassett.
35 through 38 are offered, Mr. Abowd.
Your Honor, I do have an objection under Rule 403, substantially more prejudicial than probative.
Response, Your Honor.
Well, I feel like I'm flying blind. How would I know?
Yes, Your Honor, I can wait until the exhibits are displayed before raising my objection, but I would
Is that-
object to them being entered into evidence.
Is that what you're intending to do, Mr. Nickerson? You're going to show them?
Yes, Your Honor, I plan to show these exhibits. I just wanted to avoid showing them to the jury because they haven't been entered to evidence yet.
Well, the jury's constructively sequestered for this. Okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
Then we'll deal with the 403 objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Strut, may you display exhibits 35 through 38?
Mr. Nickerson, would you like me to play them in their entirety or just click through the first couple videos?
Just click through them to identify them.
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Yes, Your Honor, and I'd like to raise my objection of substantially more prejudicial than probative.
So that was just exhibit 38, right?
Yes, Your Honor. We have to show 35 and 36, Your
Well,
Honor.
let's deal with 38. You got an unfairly prejudicial objection pending. What are you trying to prove with this, Mr. Nickerson?
Your Honor, what we're simply just showing these exhibits to the jury, Your Honor, so that after which I'll just ask her, after these exhibits were made, Don Clark disappeared on the 18th, Your Honor. We're showing that Kara Bassett did in fact say these statements, Your Honor. In order for it to be 403, it had to be substantially more prejudicial than probative. And the rationale behind that is that it must sway the fact more towards the feeling. But these videos don't do that. Therefore, do not establish 403, Your Honor.
This is the declarant is the defendant?
Correct, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
And 35 and 36, Your Honor.
You offered 35, 36, 37, and 38, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
38 is in. We haven't yet dealt with 35, 36, 37. Although if they're the declarant is the defendant and there's no other objection, then 403, those are coming in too.
Those are videos of the defendant, Your Honor.
Are you going to show them?
Yes, Your Honor. May you display exhibits 35 and 36? And being that this is a constructive redaction, Your Honor, is this still applying to my time?
What do you mean constructive redaction?
Well, we're doing this constructively outside the hearing of the jury, Your Honor, for objection purposes.
They're being showed to the jury now, just for the argument's sake. Okay, the jury's here. They're seeing all this.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, can you play exhibit 35?
So sorry, I appear to be having technical issues. Your Honor, what should I do in this case where there's a technical issue?
Well, first of all, let's stop the clock so Mr. Nickerson doesn't lose all of his cross-examination time. Is there a way to fix it quickly?
Yes, sir. Let me try something really quickly. So sorry, Your Honor.
That's all right. Mr. Abowd, does your second have a copy of this? Can we have?
Oh, I fixed it. I fixed it. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Perfect. All right.
Zoos exist to make people happy. Sanctuaries exist to make animals happy. And anyone who can't see the difference shouldn't be around animals.
Now, Miss Young, you knew that Don Clark saw the park as a zoo, isn't that right?
Oh, yeah.
And not a sanctuary, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
Response, Your Honor.
No, overruled.
And not a sanctuary, isn't that right?
That's right.
Now I'd like to turn your attention here to Exhibit 36. May my co-counsel display that one?
Yes.
Zoos. Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Now, if I recall correctly, she's referring to the statements from Don Clark, isn't that right?
Well, yes, we were. Just want to make sure that you understand that we were filming a reality show. So
Well, let me
really,
get back to my question. Aside from it being a reality show, these statements are about Don Clark, isn't that right?
well, that's what I would assume, but I don't want to speculate to her.
In which she said at the end, we will see how this ends. Did I hear that correct?
Yes.
And now I'd like to direct your attention now to Exhibit 38.
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
I thought
Now,
we already saw that, Mr. Nickerson.
we were seeing it for the purposes of entering it into evidence, Your Honor.
It's in. It's in.
And now, if I heard that correctly, I will send anyone to their graves if I have to. I heard that correct?
Yes.
And after these videos were recorded on June 15, 2017, the next thing that happened was Don Clark disappeared on August 18th of 2017. Isn't that right?
That's not the next thing that happened. I think she went out.
Oh, let me redirect you back to my question. You know he disappeared then on the 18th of August, correct?
Well, yeah, that's when he disappeared.
I pass this witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Abowd, any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
And the witness is excused. Thank you for your testimony, ma'am. You step down. Anything else from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests our case.
Okay, we should switch back to speaker view. And whenever you're ready to sum up, Mr. Nickerson, you may do so.
Yes, Your Honor. Motive, disappearance, and the reaction. Members of the jury, that is the flow in which you heard of the tragic story of the murder of Don Clark. The story in which Kara said at the end is everything that she wanted. She got her elephant sanctuary. She gets married. And the one thing she got rid of was Dawn Clark. Now, members of the jury, today you've heard a lot of evidence. And I remind you that as a prosecution, we held the burden of proof in which we had to prove to you that Kara Bassett murdered her husband in cold blood. That she murdered him deliberately and intentionally, or with a callous and wanton disregard for human life. And the evidence has shown today that she did murder her husband. So let's walk you down how we prove that. Today, the first thing you heard about from Stephen Branham was her motive. You heard about how a power of attorney clause came about in which included a disappearance clause, a clause specifically included by the defendant, Kara Bassett. You heard about how, in case of his disappearance, she would have inherited over $8 million worth of Dawn's assets. Now, members of the jury, you know that Kara Bassett loves elephants. She wanted an elephant sanctuary. However, at the time, it was a zoo. There were people touching these elephants. There was people having these elephants in cages, and she didn't want that. You heard her say, "I would do anything to protect these elephants. I would put anyone in their grave." Dawn said this, Dawn said that. We will see how this ends. And if you don't see it as a sanctuary, you don't need to be around those elephants. Members of the jury, she's established her motive. She needed to get what she wanted. And to do that, she had to get rid of Dawn Clark. Then you heard on August 18th of 2017, Dawn Clark disappeared. Now, we showed you today that the cause of that disappearance was the fact that Kara Bassett took a tranquilizer to kill Dawn Clark, took his body to a swamp and disposed of it. You heard about algae evidence. You heard about how the algae from the swamp matched algae on her boots and on the wheelchair she used to dispose of the body. That same algae was also in the van that was used to transport Dawn Clark, as you saw in the GPS records, from the park all the way to the swamp. Only certain people had access to this carfentanil. But the last person you saw to have access on August 1st was Kara Bassett, and when she logged 24, when there was only 23. Members of the jury, the evidence is clear that she killed Dawn Clark. And now, the defense wants you to believe that because there's no body, there's no murder. But nowhere does it state in murder that you have to have a body. You just have to prove that the cause of that disappearance was Kara Bassett. And that we did prove today, members of the jury. Because the next thing you heard about was an unusual reaction. You heard about how Kara Bassett not once called her husband after she disappeared. Not once texted her husband after he disappeared. Not once did she ask, "Where is Dawn Clark?" Not once did she ask, "What happened to my husband? Who killed my husband?" She didn't ask the FBI any of those questions. She didn't ask her employees any of those questions. Most importantly, she didn't ask Dunn those questions because, member of the jury, she knew the answer. She didn't have to ask them. And because she didn't have to ask them, it is clear that she killed her husband. Members of the jury, you have to focus not only on the story, but the evidence in today's case. And the evidence shows she murdered her husband, Dawn Clark. We have proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt, which means you have no choice but to find in favor of the prosecution and to hold her guilty for the murder of Dawn Clark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nickerson. Mr. Abowd.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. They don't have a body. They don't have a murder weapon. They don't have an eyewitness. All they have is a story. Now, members of the jury, Mr. Nickerson just got up here and told you that he was going to tell you a story in his own words. Members of the jury, this is a story in which he portrays the defendant as a cold-blooded murderer. But this story isn't based on facts and evidence. This story is based on speculation, assumptions, and conjecture. This story fails to carry the most fundamental obligation carried by the government, to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Because they have charged the defendant, Kara Bassett, with first-degree murder. They carry the burden of proof, and it's their responsibility to prove that Kara Bassett intentionally and deliberately killed her husband. But members of the jury, they have not met this burden because they don't have a body, they don't have a murder weapon, they don't have an eyewitness. All they have is a story. Now, in his closing argument, Mr. Nickerson just stated that in their murder investigation, it didn't matter if they didn't have a body. Members of the jury, you've heard today from their own witness that that's not the case. The first thing they look for in a missing persons investigation is a body. And you've heard today how Agent Steph Branham tried to do exactly that. She searched the greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, found absolutely no signs of a struggle. She searched the Big Gum Swamp, leading a team of agents with trained dogs, and how she still found nothing. No clothes, no bones, no body. Now, the next part of the government's story is a syringe of carfentanil. But members of the jury, they haven't been able to provide you with a forensic report showing that the carfentanil was the cause of death. They haven't been able to explain that because they never found his body. Now, in addition to that, you've heard today that multiple people had access to those syringes, and on top of all of that, they never found it. They never found that syringe, which they claim is the murder weapon. Now, finally, the story that they told you today has no eyewitnesses. No one claiming to see Mrs. Bassett killing her husband. No one claiming to see her driving the van. The only evidence that they have is algae. Algae that was tested in a report that stated that the conclusion was not certain. And why is it not certain, members of the jury? Because they only tested one place. They didn't test to see if that algae could have come from any other location. Now, finally, Mr. Nickerson said that Kara Bassett didn't ask the questions, but members of the jury, they are the ones who didn't ask the questions. They are the ones who already chose an answer before they considered the other evidence. Because nowhere in his argument did Mr. Nickerson, did he address the evidence that has been presented to you today that their story ignores. Nowhere in his closing argument did he tell you about Lisa Clark, about the mysterious phone calls and texts to Costa Rica. Nowhere did he tell you that Lisa Clark had threatened to sue, that she was suing her husband at the time of his disappearance, that she had threatened to wipe him off the face of the earth, and that she had no alibi. You see, the government's investigation paid no attention to the fact that Don Clark had a 52-minute phone call with an unidentified Costa Rican phone number hours before his disappearance. The government is not able to tell you who he was talking to, what he was talking about, or why he was talking to them. Members of the jury, ultimately, their story just has too many unanswered questions. And while they try to convince you that the defendant, Kara Bassett, is guilty by showing you videos from a reality TV show, the fact of the matter is they have a burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And a story does not meet that burden. They need to have the facts and the evidence. But members of the jury, you learned today that they don't. Because they don't have a body. They don't have a murder weapon. They don't have an eyewitness. All they have is a story. Find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abowd. Mr. Nickerson, rebuttal.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, the defense wants you to focus on these other individuals. However, the evidence in today's case only points to one person. Lisa Clark didn't have algae on her boots, Kara Bassett did. Lisa Clark did call Don Clark after he disappeared, Kara Bassett didn't. Kara Bassett has interviews stating these words, "I will put anyone to their grave." Lisa Clark doesn't. Kara Bassett is the one who all the evidence points to. Lisa Clark didn't drive the van that night. Kara Bassett did. Lisa Clark didn't work on Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. Kara Bassett did. Lisa Clark didn't have access to the tool shed that held the tranquilizers. Kara Bassett did. And all of these items are the reason why Don Clark disappeared. He said that wasn't a part of our story, but it was. I told you, in the disappearance, he disappeared because of the tranquilizer, because of the body being disposed in the swamp. Members of the jury, the story had all the evidence in it. And the story shows that it was Kara Bassett who murdered her husband. Members of the jury, don't forget the fact that she didn't ask the questions. She didn't ask where he was. What happened to him? Who killed him? Why did he disappear? She knew the answers already, and the defense is trying to hide that from you. Members of the jury, you have no choice but to look at the evidence here and find in favor of the prosecution and hold the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nickerson. The scores are instructed to complete their ballots and submit them.